Welcome to the Badgecast 1 podcast with your host, Brian Ellis, a 20-plus year veteran police leader who's dedicated to helping police officers be their highest and best. Our show aims to dive deep to deliver leadership strategies of top experts to turbocharge public safety leadership. This podcast is brought to you by the National Command and Staff College. To find out more about our team, please visit us at www.commandcollege.org. The National Command and Staff College is passionate about enhancing your leadership capabilities and building the best version of you.
Good day, everyone. Welcome back to the Badgecast 1 podcast. I'm your host, Brian Ellis. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If not, welcome back. Today, we'll be speaking with Michael Lee Stallard, author of Fired Up or Burned Out: How to Reignite Your Team's Passion, Creativity, and Productivity. And his second book, which will be the conversation of today, is Connection Culture: The Competitive Advantage of a Shared Identity, Empathy, and Understanding. Michael is a thought leader who is widely recognized in effective human connection and has a lengthy resume, including being an author, a speaker, and collaborator, not to mention a friend, mentor, and someone who is passionate about helping others. I hope you enjoyed our show today, and always look for your feedback, which you can provide at my email at bls@commandcollege.org. Finally, I urge you to check out the National Command and Staff College at www.commandcollege.org to see a wide array of opportunities available to you to turbocharge your leadership potential. You can sign up for updates, look at our calendar of events, or reach out to us to host a training in your area. Thanks again for listening today, and here we go. Well, good morning, Mike. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brian. Nice to be with you today.
Thanks for joining us today. I first want to ask you what you're up to right now.
Well, we're doing a lot of workshops and keynote speeches, and it's in just a mix of organizations. We're going to be speaking to 350 healthcare professionals, including physicians at Yale New Haven Health, which is one of the top 10 healthcare systems in the U.S. And we just train high potential leaders for Toll Brothers, America's largest home builder. So we're doing that. We're also working on an article about cultures in healthcare and how loneliness is a systemic risk to healthcare organizations these days because it affects patients, physicians, it affects a physician burnout issue and the high rate of suicide, non-physician professionals in healthcare, and it affects people in the C-suite because half the CEOs report that they're lonely. So those are just some of the things we're working on off the top of my head.
Nice. Definitely staying busy then, I see.
Yeah.
What about reading? Are you reading anything fun?
Well, I've been reading a book about the effects of dopamine. It's called The Molecule of More, and I've been enjoying that. That's the book I've been focused on of late. But I have a big pile that I'm working my way through, as I imagine you do, Brian, knowing you a bit. So.
Yeah, the problem is you get halfway into a book, and then at least my problem is I go squirrel, and I jump into something else, and then my stack is like, okay, I've got 4 or 5 half-read books, and I just sit down and just kind of go through them in order as opposed to just letting them stack. So a little chaotic there, but we wanted to have you on because I'm really. I met you. This is kind of a funny story. I met you. I bought your book, your first book, Fired Up or Burned Out, and it was one of those books I just felt myself saying yes, 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 and especially I saw a lot of the things that you were describing in that book in policing, and the book hit me really hard. And there's been a couple of books in the course of my life where I've had a really strong connection to, and you search for the back of like, hey, how do you connect with this person? And I remember shooting you an email and was really excited to talk to you initially. As a matter of fact, I was on a bike ride getting ready to do this Race Across America event, and when you called, I pulled over to the side of the road, and our first phone call was, somewhere up in the mountainous region of Auburn, California, and I'm just sitting there chatting with a guy that I really enjoyed the first book, and so from there, when I got to read Connection Culture, again, to me it was another home run, and I was fortunate enough to at least do a little project with you, which I'm grateful for, but I really want to focus in on Connection Culture today because it is such a great book, and there's a lot of different just golden nuggets in there. And so, can you first describe? You talk about the three distinct psychosocial cultures, which are connection, control, and indifference. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and why they're important to understand?
Sure. Yeah, and the way we describe it, Brian, when we're teaching workshops and giving keynote speeches is that a good way to think about cultures is they either connect people, which is good, or they're disconnecting for various reasons. And in the disconnecting cultures, people feel lonely. They may be socially isolated. They also may be so busy that they don't take time to develop supportive relationships. So it's kind of a form of constructive loneliness. Although because they're around people, they may not say they're lonely, but they don't have meaningful relationships in their life, and so they dysfunction. And of the cultures that are disconnecting, we describe them as a culture of control, and that's where people with power, control, influence, and status rule over the rest. And this culture creates an environment where people fear to make mistakes or take risks. And also you see in those cultures that there's very low employee engagement because people need some autonomy in their work rather than being ruled over all the time. The second type of culture is the culture of indifference, and that tends to be the culture where people are just busy and it crowds out time for relationships. But that's not a healthy culture either. It's the culture where people feel connected to their supervisor, to the people they work with, and ultimately to the people they're serving. And that's one of the reasons I really love community policing efforts. I think that it provides an additional layer of connection. And we have all kinds of examples, even in our local community, where we see the benefits of that, where people have personal relationships with police officers and contact information where they see something and they call their friend who's on the police force. So anyway, in a nutshell, that's what cultures of control, indifference, and connection are how we frame cultures. And of course, a culture is the language, the attitudes, language, and behavior of a group.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I mean, obviously people can see that a culture of control is definitely just, it's archaic and doesn't really work, but that the culture of indifference, I mean, we live in a fast-paced world, and it is that, just like you said, the power of connection, even as a police officer with a citizen, and maybe even if it's the first time, just taking that extra step and developing a little bit of rapport and really engaging in somebody can make all the difference in the world in that moment, and maybe potentially even future opportunities to gain support in that community, or just get other information, or link somebody to some kind of services that they need. So I think that's incredibly important to think about, because we're so driven by our phones, by social media, technology in general. I know in government, we have fewer and fewer resources, but our expectations and our workload keep driving up. So I just see it seems to be very important, and thanks for sharing that. So,
sure, yeah, I think workplace cultures are just more and more they're crushing people because of the work demands that you just referenced, but also because they've crowded out time for connection that protects us from the negative effects of stress. And when our body doesn't have that, we're hardwired to connect. When we don't have that, we're less able to cope with stressors, and it puts our body in a state of stress response. So that means blood glucose and oxygen is being over-allocated to the fight or flight systems and under-allocated to parts of the brain, the immune system, the reproductive system and also the digestive system are not getting the resources they need to be healthy. So no surprise, it shaves years off a person's life if they're stuck in that state of chronic stress response.
Wow. Yeah. All health starts in the gut, right? So,
Yeah.
you make reference in the book that, connection is so important that it's backed by science, that there's, citing a lot of neuroscience in the book. And so, why do you think there is that disconnect within organizational life? I mean, I get it; people get busy, but why do you see so much of it? I mean, there just seems to be a lot of it.
Well, I think it is, I use myself as an example. I worked on Wall Street. I commuted from Connecticut into Manhattan. I got involved in some really challenging mergers, and it crowded out time in my life, Brian, to really connect in the workplace. But also when I was home, I was thinking about work. I really wasn't present. So I was, I was thinking about work basically, all my waking hours across the week. And I started not feeling well. But I had no idea. I would not have said I was lonely, but I had no idea that my body is hardwired for connection. When I don't have it, I'm more vulnerable to stressors like we just talked about. And that's why I wasn't feeling well. So eventually I ended up leaving Wall Street. I took some years off, and that's when I started doing research and found that all cultures are not alike. There is a best culture, and that's a culture that connects people. So, but what I find is, and it's interesting, we're doing a lot of work in healthcare, and this is something that doctors don't really learn in medical school. And that's why you see physician burnout. About a little under half of the physicians show signs of professional burnout, and the suicide rate in physicians is about 50% higher than the normal population. So, this is something they are not completely aware of, that they need connection. And it's been interesting to see that some of the organizations that have created healthy cultures, like the Mayo Clinic is one of my favorites, and they've implemented a couple of things that have really helped. One is they created a program called Compass, where they provide a stipend of $20 twice a month to physicians who get together in small groups and have a meal together. And they have found that helps reduce burnout. The second thing they've done is, for years, healthcare hospitals did away with physician lounges. And so there wasn't really a place where they could congregate. But the Mayo Clinic has brought them back, because they're finding if they can do those things, it will help create support groups for their physicians, for their nurses and other non-physician professionals across the system, for their scientists, because it's a big research institution. It reduces burnout. And so it seems so simple, doesn't it? And yet it just shows how hardwired we are to connect, and connection just makes us more resilient to deal with challenges in our life that are inevitable.
Yeah, that's amazing. And as well, that connection, especially in that industry, saves lives. It gives people hope, patients, hope for the future. And I know that you have some experience in that area as well.
Yes, my wife Katie is a 3-time cancer survivor, and there was a time when her risk of survival was less than 10%, and our daughters were just 12 and 10 at the time, and that was a time of stress and anxiety for me. Katie, my wife, didn't want to see the research on her diagnosis, but I wanted to read all the research. And when I discovered her chances of survival were remote, I felt a lot of stress and anxiety about losing my beloved best friend, and our daughters losing this really wonderful mother. And then Katie did the normal course of treatment for ovarian cancer. And then we went to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which has been the number 1 or 2 cancer center in the U.S. and the oldest cancer center for more than, almost 30 years. It's been rated number 1 or 2 in the U.S. And we went there and just found this incredible culture of connection. I remember we were walking down the street, Brian, and I was not looking forward to walking into this place. I just expected a culture of death and dying. But what I found was the opposite. It was a culture of life and living, and even the doorman, a guy named Nick Medley, he locked his eyes on Katie when she got within eyesight and smiled. And we walked in. It just gave us this. We still see Nick when Katie is there at least a few times a year, and they're one of our clients. We do work with them now, so on creating a life-giving culture. And we walked in the reception area. There was a receptionist calling everyone honey. The security people, the administrative people were helpful and friendly. We met our oncologist. Dr. Marty Hensley is her name, and she was upbeat and optimistic. And, by the end of that day, I just felt optimistic that even though the odds were against Katie's survival, I just felt that with this team and the fact that they cared and their competence, that we could get Katie through this. And this year we celebrated her 15th year of being cancer-free from ovarian cancer.
That's amazing. And yeah, another explanation point for this connection. And I mean, I even think about it. One of my favorite vacations as a kid, my grandparents took me to British Columbia, and we were at a bed and breakfast that, the people that ran it were just so nice. And just the memories that I have. I mean, I've probably been on dozens of vacations as a kid, but that one I really, really remember just very vividly, and even some of the conversations that I have. And I think something in the brain just connected me to that memory more than going to some of the trips to Disneyland or other places that we went. So it's really important. So let's pivot to this. You talk about the concept of human versus machines, and I know that as you start thinking about it, we are in a rat race all the time, bigger, stronger, faster. There's all this cumulative stress in our lives. So, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and maybe how do we kind of start unwinding that momentum of at least work life in that general direction.
Well, that's a huge issue, as you can imagine, as you know. And you just think about our lives today. We're spending more time interacting with machines, whether it's our smartphones or our computers, or even just in bed, recovery time. We're binge watching things on Netflix and et cetera. And there's a lot of great things out there. Nothing against Netflix, but we have to be intentional about disconnecting and making sure we connect with people. And here's why: because all the machine interactions really produce dopamine. And dopamine is, there's about 100 neurotransmitters. Dopamine is a pretty powerful one. And it's called the molecule of more because dopamine is addictive. It's based on, so if you're expecting a reward, it's the expectation of that reward that produces dopamine. So it's always wanting more. Once you receive that award, the dopamine kicks off. And then, in a sense, you could experience withdrawal. And the only way to satisfy that is through some other pathway that produces positive emotion, whether it's additional dopamine, which is what the dopamine receptors tend to want. But when you look at healthy individuals, they have a way to think of it, they have support and challenge in their lives. The support comes in the form of relationships that produces another pathway to positive emotion. It's based on neurotransmitters like serotonin, oxytocin, also endorphins. There are other hormones and neurotransmitters in the mix, but they tend to produce a different type of positive emotion that makes us feel more content and less desirous of more. And so when you look at the healthy leaders, like I know you and I have talked about Admiral Vern Clark, who's the chief of the U.S. Navy, or Alan Mulally, who saved Ford Motor Company, or Francis Hesselbein, who turned around the Girl Scouts. I know all of them, and when you get to know them, you see that they're amazing at relationships, and they really value relationships with spouses, with close friends, with people in the workplace. And they also have challenge in their life. So they have that support in the form of relationships that's producing neurotransmitters like serotonin and oxytocin, and they have the challenge that produces dopamine. But because they're not addicted to just dopamine alone, which is what you see in lonely individuals who don't have those supportive relationships, their leadership is sustainable. If you're just addicted to just focused on results, you're not really present when you're interacting with people. And presence produces, when you're present with people, that also produces serotonin. If you're always thinking about the future and kind of disconnecting in relationships, then that produces dopamine. And if you're just relying on dopamine as a source of positive emotion in your life, you're going to experience a crash sometime, because dopamine is never satisfied. And you're always going to want more. And eventually, you'll hit a point where you can't achieve more, and that's when the crash happens. So it's very important for all of us to live healthy lives that are sustainable, to develop supportive relationships and challenge. That combination is really critical, and you see it in all the great leaders.
Yeah, you just described my last movie experience when I realized there was no more popcorn in the bag. Right? It's like, oh God, I'm all done. Yeah, it's awesome. So the crux of the connection culture is this concept of vision, value, and voice. And so can you flesh this out for us a little bit and explain what you mean by this, and how can an organization bring all those three things together?
Sure. Yeah, let me just use one example because I think it helps. Well, I'll just summarize vision, value, voice. The way we describe it is when a leader communicates an inspiring vision about serving a cause greater than self, when they value people, and when they give people a voice, it creates connections. So those three things: vision, value, and voice. And here's a quick example. So in 2000, Admiral Vern Clark became the chief of the Navy. He's called the CNO. He's the highest ranking officer in the U.S. Navy. And at that time, the Navy was not achieving its first term reenlistment goal. Now, when I wrote the article, I thought what I heard from the Navy was the reenlistment rate was higher than it actually was. What I subsequently learned was, in reality, the first term reenlistment rate for enlisted sailors was under 20%. So 80% of the enlisted sailors were opting to leave the Navy at the first opportunity.
Wow.
That is a disaster from a personnel standpoint, because you're losing all that expertise, and the Navy is complex these days. When you have,
Right.
a lot of the energy is sourced from nuclear materials, and just the complexity of all the systems in the Navy require, competence across the board in these areas, and they were losing all these people. So Admiral Clark knew that he had been the commander of the Atlantic Fleet, and when he came in, he started changing the culture. And you see it in a number of ways. He talked about the Navy's mission was to take the warfighting readiness of the United States to any corner of the world at a moment's notice. And he would say, and I'm quoting some out of his speeches, which I have in front of me. He talked about, it's our turn to make history, to build the Navy for the 21st century that will be strategically and operationally agile, technologically and organizationally innovative, networked at every level and highly joint with the other services, and effectively integrated with our allies. And what he would say to enlisted sailors and the master chiefs, who are the leaders of the enlisted class in the Navy, he would say, what we do matters. What we do is hard work. We intentionally put ourselves in harm's way. We are away from our loved ones for months on end, but we do it because it's important work. And we're people of service. We are committed to something larger than ourselves, the protection of America's interests around the world and democracy. And I remember, Brian, I was interviewing an admiral in the Navy, and he told me he was on an aircraft carrier one time when Admiral Clark was speaking to sailors, and he saw a young sailor walk by him, and his eyes were filled with tears. And he asked him, "Are you okay?" And the sailor said, "Sir, I'm going to my commanding officer to tell him to rip up my discharge papers because for the first time, a leader told me why I need to serve in the Navy." And, if you could have heard this admiral tell this story, you could tell it really connected with him. And when you look at, so that's the vision element. Value and voice, Admiral Clark was amazing at that too. So value, he did things that made sailors feel valued. He talked about, he described the Navy as having an asymmetrical advantage of the best technology in the world combined with the genius of our people. And when Navy budget officials proposed cutting training and development in the budget, he told them to go back and he wanted to actually increase training and development. So he created these 12 Navy centers of excellence around the world that are, they're naval education and training commands. And he invested in training to help enlisted sailors do their work better, but also give them skills that they could use post their career in the Navy. And, one of the things Admiral Clark said is, if you're not growing, you're dead, which biologically is true. When an organism stops growing, it's dead. So he created mentoring he asked the master chiefs to mentor the enlisted sailors under their command. And he always told a story about when he was on his first ship, he had a master chief came up to him and said, "Mr. Clark, I like you and I'm going to make you a fine officer." And he said this older master chief, a guy named Chief Leedy, really made him a better sailor, a better person, and a better leader. And he asked the master chiefs to do that with the young people under their command, to mentor them, to help them become better sailors, better people, and eventually leaders. And those are just a few things. There's so many things. Admiral Clark also gave enlisted sailors, a voice. They used to call it slamming in the Navy, where people were put into positions and in locations that they didn't like. So Admiral Clark worked with his colleagues, and they created a bidding system where if you're qualified, you could bid on a position somewhere around the world that you wanted to serve. Wow. And it reduced slamming from about 30% of the positions down to, I want to say it was about under 2%. So it really gave people a voice about where they could serve and in what role. So those are just a few of the things. I mean, the thing you see about Admiral Clark is he cares about sailors and their families. And I would add Connie Clark too. His wife was amazing. And, they first term reenlistment soared from under 20% to almost 60% in 18 months. So it had a huge effect on the Navy in attracting and retaining the talent that the Navy needed to perform at the top of its game.
That's amazing. And I love that quote. I mean, that's one of my favorite quotes. And I think there's so much carryover from that quote, that the quote from him, what we do matters. What we do is hard work. And we intentionally put ourselves in harm's way because it's important for people. We're people of service. I mean, that to me, that's policing. It
is.
It's the same kind of goal, overarching goal. There is it's this public service, and so with that, and I mean, what would you, if you had an opportunity to sit in front of a police leader right now, and knowing what you know about, the story that you just told me, what advice would you have for a public safety leader in regards to priorities?
Well, a couple things I would say. Number one, you can't give what you don't have. So you need to make sure that you have connection in your life. You need to cultivate, family, friends who you can process your life with. So, for example, for me, I'm traveling a lot. Our business is growing at a rapid pace. And so we're under a lot of pressure, but I am close to my wife, but also I'm in a small men's Bible study on Saturday mornings from 9 a.m. till noon. And that's really my group for me, that I can share what's going on in my life and have their support. We've been together for a number of years, and I think, we just last week we had 16 guys. The youngest was in his late 20s and the oldest was in his 80s. And yeah, it's so life-giving for me. So to cultivate those kind of relationships, you really need that. And if you don't have it, to have to develop a mentor or a coach, some people that you can process your week-to-week life with, and that helps you make better decisions. It calms your nervous system. It gives you that support you need to cope with challenges in life. So that's number one. Then secondly, for leaders in policing, don't underestimate the power of talking about serving a cause greater than self and sharing stories about the positive things that the people under your command are doing. And Admiral Clark, I remember he had a term for it, and I think I'm going to forget how he described it. But he would have someone just stand up and share something good that was going on, that he knew about in advance. And I think he called it letting some of his leaders take laps, like victory laps. And so it's important to do that. And then also just, mentoring, coaching, looking out for the people under your command if you see signs they're isolating themselves, that is a dangerous sign. They really need to feel like they're supported by their colleagues and by you as their supervisor. So, keep an eye out for anyone who's isolating themselves. You want to make sure that they feel supported and they have a place to process what's going on, because policing is stressful.
Right.
And that'll help them make better decisions. It'll help protect their body. The other thing is if they're under stress and they don't have connection, then there's a high risk of a thing called displacement aggression. And when we have high levels of stress, it's more likely we're going to take it out on others in either physical or verbally violent ways, and that will reduce stress on the part of the perpetrator. So if you want to have a more effective group in policing, then make sure they have ways to cope with stress, including exercise, but especially connection. Connection is number one. Things like exercise, meditation, prayer, those are also important. But job one is making sure they stay connected, because they're most likely to drift if they're under stress and become less connected. That's our drift pattern. As human beings, we isolate ourselves and try to hunker down and do it on our own. We can't do it on our own. And so we really need other people to support us. And then finally, making sure people have, asking them what's right, what's wrong, what's missing from your thinking, and just getting them talking. That calms their nervous system. When they talk, they actually like you more when they talk more than you do. And so looking for ways to get them processing together, giving them a voice is really important too. And those things will all boost their performance and the performance of your team collectively.
So do you think there's, going back to your example of, spending time with others, do you think it's beneficial to have kind of a diverse group in which you connect with? I mean, I know one of the biggest issues that police officers have is, they tend to work shift work. That shift work doesn't always correlate with having normal people's days off. So there's a lot of times police officers are connecting with other police officers, and they're kind of somewhat socially isolated to a degree. I think, as we emerge, that's becoming more of a topic and an awareness issue in the profession, that I think that just having that awareness that people are being more intentional to get out and have more connections with people outside of policing. But do you think that matters at all too?
Well, I think it does, because it allows you to get away from work and conversations. And so, developing a diverse group of friends who are not involved in policing, that's just healthy for you. It's going to give you a break away from talking about work all the time.
Right.
And so, just intentionally seeking that balance so that you have friendships outside of policing, I think that's just going to make you healthier, because it's more likely that you're going to be connecting with them on personal things. And, we have personal stressors in our lives too. When you look at the research, it would say, often personal economic issues, relationship issues, if we have disagreements in our family or stress in our family, which most of us do, and then also just stress from work. And so having ways to process that outside of the workplace is healthy. And, with spouses if you're married, with a support group, with friends who are not involved in policing, share the things that you can share, of course, then that's going to help make your body cooperate, and you'll perform better when you're in the workplace, because we're hardwired to connect, and when you have that need met, we perform better.
Yeah, and you mentioned him earlier, the CEO of Ford's ex-CEO, Alan Mullaney, hit the power of teams. You talk about the power of teams, and you highlight Alan's story in your book, and I think you touched on it a little bit. Can you expand a little bit of why Alan's leadership at Ford was so significant? What made him an outlier?
Well, when he went in, forgive me, I'll tell a little longer story here. I'll try to keep it short, but it's such a great story, Brian, because here's Mullally coming in. He has no experience in automotive, right? He's coming into a company that's losing something like $15 billion a year, and on its way to bankruptcy if it doesn't turn it around. And one of the first questions that he was asked as he was introduced to the press was, Mr. Mullally, what kind of car do you drive? His response was, I drive a Lexus, the finest car in the world. And here he is at Ford, right? I'm sure that's kind of stopped all conversation. And then the next question, someone said, Mr. Mullally, you come from the aerospace industry. You're an aerospace engineer. What makes you think you can, without any experience in automotive, turn around a company that's in such trouble? And he said, well, at Boeing, where he had headed Boeing, years ago, and he said the average airplane has 4 million parts. The average car has about 4,000 parts, and we have to keep airplanes in the air. And so, I think his response was, I think this can be done. This is not that as complex as you think. And the great thing about Alan is, and I've spoken with him, and I've talked to other people at Ford who said when he was there, he was so great about just interacting with everyone. I think it took him forever to walk through the halls because he's making eye contact and interacting with everyone. He's very personable. He loves people, and he's just great at connecting with them. And he's super competent as an engineer and a leader. And so when you look for what he did, and he has told me that what we wrote about him in the book was the most concise, accurate description of what happened in the turnaround of Ford. And when you look for vision, what he communicated in terms of vision at Ford was he kind of went back to Henry Ford's original vision for Ford Motor Company, which he described as opening the highways for all mankind so that people could connect with their families, make new friends. It would just be better for America. And in terms of valuing people, Alan always talked about, having one Ford. Now, when he went into the culture, it was a culture that was kind of passive aggressive, where people would use humor to put each other down, and there were battles between the silos and battles between leaders inside Ford. And Alan would not put up with it. In fact, he forbid people to use humor at the expense of others. That's a real sore point for him. And he talked about one Ford, the power of teams, working together always works. He used language that was focused on getting Ford people to work together. And he had weekly meetings that involved people worldwide. And if there were problems in one part of Ford, he would look for the people wherever they were, across the silos, to pull them in and fly them to the source of where the problem was to solve it. And so it started to create more of a culture of cooperation. And in these weekly meetings that were called BPA meetings, business process something or other, he encouraged people to speak up and help each other. And, Ford, when he came in 2014, was in real trouble. By the time he left he came in 2006. And by the time he left in 2014, Ford had experienced 19 consecutive quarters of profit and rising market share in the U.S. And unlike the other automotive companies in the U.S., they did not have a government bailout. They refused any money from the federal government, and they were wildly successful. When he announced his retirement from Ford, the people there gave him a standing ovation. Wow. So he's a phenomenal leader, and I know he's on Google's board and the board of the Mayo Clinic. now, and he's getting offers all the time to lead companies. But I think he's kind of moved on and focusing more on leadership these days.
Nice. And
Yeah.
one thing that resonates from that story to me is just how much he values people. And I mean, I think everybody wants to be recognized by the boss, whether it's just eye contact or an acknowledgement of doing a good job. And I mean, you're at work, not just a. I mean, most people are at work for more than just a paycheck, and I think that's a really good opportunity for bosses to always connect with people. I mean, never miss an opportunity to connect. Matter of fact, I know an old mentor of mine said that he used to have to come in. He was a local sheriff, and he would come in super early at like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning just to get his stuff done. Because by the time people started getting in the office, he knew he wouldn't get a lot of work done because he's out and about talking to people. And I think that just goes to show you just a good way of leading people. They all want that attention.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, because when you study the great leaders, they're not ones to hold themselves up in the office. Now they have decisions that have to be made, and they have to read things, of course, but they're great about being out there and just mixing with people. And Alan says that step one in leadership is learning to love the people, and I think he uses that language as to get people's attention, because you don't often hear that in business, especially loving your people. But what he means is you have to care for your people, and if you don't care for people, they're not going to follow you. They may follow you out of your authority because you hire, fire, pay, and promote, but they're not going to follow you because they want to, and that's when you get the best performance, when they want to follow you, and that's because they feel connected to you.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think especially in policing, that's kind of hard to do all the time because police officers we're routinely in field work, and that field work is somewhat isolating in of itself. And so you really have to capitalize on the opportunities that you do have with people, whether it's a specific function, whether it's the start of shift, or just joining up with people during their lunch break. It's just never missing those opportunities, because it's not like it's a office place where you get to sit with somebody for several hours throughout the day.
Yeah, take every opportunity to connect. It reminds me of one time I interviewed Jim Goodnight, who's the founder of SAS Institute, the largest privately held technology company in the world, I believe. And he's very introverted. He was a statistics professor, and he started SAS Institute, and he's connecting with him didn't come easy. But what Jim did is he went out and he would sit down in the SAS Institute cafeteria with groups of employees he didn't know. And it shows a lot of courage and wisdom on the part of the leader. And Jim and his wife also live on the campus of it's in Cary, South Carolina. And so they, he's been very intentional about being out there connecting over lunchtime, like you just suggested. And also he has these sessions he calls Java with Jim, where he just shows up and they serve coffee and soft drinks. And it's just a time where people can ask questions. And I think he's come to love that because he loves the people who work at SAS. And it's pretty neat to see how successful that company has been. Phenomenally successful.
That's awesome. So as we're wrapping up here, can you offer some police officers some just intentional ways in which, and I know we've covered a lot of things right now and uncovered some things to really think about, but do you have any kind of intentional steps of to kind of just baby steps or building blocks to help increase their connection? Because I think really that connection does transcend their role as being a public servant, whether it's in the office or out in the work environment, interacting with the community, or at home, or a combination thereof. I mean, what are some intentional things that somebody can do right now to start getting them more geared up towards being more connected?
Well, number one, get a mentor. Ask someone to hold you accountable. Tell them you're trying to connect more, and ask them to keep an eye on you and hold you accountable and give you ideas about how to connect. One thing that's a big issue today is, a lot of time when people are not doing something, they'll default to checking the news and checking their emails on their smartphone, and even when they're in conversations. And so step one is to make sure that have the mentor, but also be very intentional about being present in conversations with the people you lead in your command. You need to focus on them, and also put your cell phone aside, put it in your pocket, put it in your desk. Don't have it out while you're talking to people, because just the temptation is too great. And research shows that you're going to be more effective in connecting with people when the cell phone is not visibly present. So that's one thing you can do. I'll also, Brian, I can send you a PDF of Fired Up or Burned Out. And, my publisher, HarperCollins, is so generous to do this, but they've said I can share that with anyone.
Wow.
So I'll send that, and then your officers who are listening to your podcast can just print it out, or they can read it on their screen. I prefer personally printing it out and reading it, and it'll give them a lot of ideas about how to connect. And also it has 20 great stories of leaders throughout history who created connection cultures, and people love those 20 stories.
Yeah, it's very generous of you, Mike, and that I love that book. And again, it's on the like I said, there's 10, 15 books that I have that they're go-to books, because there's just so much good stuff, and they're high. They might as well entirely be highlighted, because the highlighters got the best of some of those books. But I appreciate that. Thanks a lot. And one last question that I had for you today is, how does one keep up on the things that you're doing?
Well, you could go to connectionculture.com, and we've also started a Connection Culture Academy, where we have people from around the world are going through it in cohorts. So I think in this current cohort, we have people from Costco, from the Federal Aviation Administration, from Turner Construction, a real mix. And maybe in the future, we'll do one that's that is people who are in policing. That might be something we do down the road. But for now, it's a mix. And I do find that having people from diverse backgrounds, different organizations sharing how they connect and the challenges they face, sometimes you just learn more from people who are not in what you do. Don't focus on policing in particular. And they've just developed some things that can be applied in policing. So I think you were, Brian, you were in our pilot, and people loved it. You had great ideas, and people, irrespective of what they were doing, what their profession was, really loved the contributions you made. So thank you for doing that. And that if you want to become more involved, that would be something to check out. We open it up. We offer the Connection Culture Academy twice a year in the spring. We are currently have one in process. And then we'll open it back up in the fall. So that could be one way that people could, it's more expensive to bring us in personally, but that keeps the cost down and allows people to, especially if they're spread out geographically, to participate.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, thanks again for joining us today. I hope you're well, and have a great day.
Thank you, and thanks for all you're doing, Brian.
Thanks. Have a great one.
Take care.
Thanks again for listening to our show today, and as always, we encourage your feedback. You can provide that feedback at my email at bellis@commandcollege.org. As always, good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Figure out who you are and be purposeful. Be well.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Badgecast 1 podcast. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with a colleague. Please be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Statement and views on this podcast are those of the guests, and the opinions of the guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility of statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representation or warranties about guests or qualifications or credibility. This podcast is the product of the National Command and Staff College. Copyright 2010 to 2035. Any use of this without the express consent of the National Command and Staff College is strictly prohibited by law. For more information, email us at info@commandcollege.org.